on enemies. Looking around at the world now in 2022, with tensions rising between America and China and Taiwan Straits and so on, and then looking back as a historian over the centuries and centuries of conflict and war in Europe and elsewhere, it's a very depressing scene. Why is it that human beings seem to want to have enemies? I personally, I'm perhaps not a pacifist, but I personally try and live peacefully with my neighbours and with my family and with friends and with people from other nations and so on. And I would go to great lengths to try and avoid having to create them into enemies and thereby just find myself in a state of fear, combined fear and aggression. And I'm sure that many people individually are like that. They don't want to have their children killed in war or anything else. And yet, as a race of human beings, we seem to be really dead set on creating enemies to fear. And this is something which, as an anthropologist, has interested me, war and fighting throughout history. And I came to the first conclusion, which is that human beings are naturally competitive, aggressive. They, like other animals, have to strive to survive, the survival of the fittest. And this has led to almost universal kinds of competition and the creation of enemies. Maybe not so much in the first long period of hunting and gathering when you were scarce on the planet, but from tribal societies onwards, there's constant constituting of an enemy. And then thinking about why we should do this, beyond some innate survival mechanism, there do seem to be other reasons, and they're very predominant now. One is that it, in a strange way, gives a meaning to your life. You can see this in competitive games. Although I didn't fight normal wars as a child and growing up, I was constantly fighting quite aggressive games, rugby, football, and so on. And these were periodic, temporary war. You made the other side your enemy and you tried to defeat them. You tried to defeat them within the rules of the game, and many people have tried to make modern warfare subject to the rules of war. But the aim was to outwit, outmaneuver, and in the end overcome your enemy. And while you're playing it and looking forward to it, you get a real buzz. You get a real sense of solidarity within your group. So warfare gives you a community spirit which almost no other big activity gives you. And so it seems pretty obvious that particularly the very competitive extremes, which is my own culture, the British and the Americans and the Anglosphere, they really need, at quite a deep level, some other against which they match themselves. And if you look, for example, at the recent history of the world since the Second World War, for a long time the West had the other of the Soviet Union, and that gave impetus to its own self-identity and also, of course, to its arms manufacturers and many other benefits like that. Then, from 1991, that had vanished, and for a few years there was no obvious enemy, and this was quite destabilizing. you could try and make Islam your enemy and attack Iraq and so on like that, but it wasn't very plausible because they were a bit dispersed and fragmentary enemies. But in the last very recent 3, 4, 5 years, the West has found its desired enemies again. One is in Russia, which it's goaded and provoked into becoming very aggressive and invading Ukraine. And the other, increasingly day by day, drip by drip, is China. They are, as people actually put it, our existential enemies, or at least opponents or foes, or, we're not out to destroy them, but they are a threat to our security, they are a threat to their... There's nothing I've encountered in my 17 visits to China or reading Chinese history to suggest that any of this paranoia in the West is founded on anything at all. It's a projection of your own aggressive imperial past onto China and assuming that they will do the same thing as you did when you were top nations and empires. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the deeper background is. The real thing is to unite your country, because it's well known that if you're in a fragile state as a politician or a government, then the best thing is to have a good war against someone, and your population has to rally round and forget their grievances for a while. So Donald Trump knew this and constituted China as the enemy, the most dangerous threat to America in world history and the rest of it. And although that has gone a little bit, it's coming back. So we need enemies. We make them, and then suddenly overnight something changes, and the people who were our enemies are now our best friends. This has happened again and again with the French and the British, for example, and hopefully it'll happen again. Perhaps the only thing that will really cause it to happen is if we have an existential enemy of a larger kind outside. In other words, Martians invade, and then we're all human beings protecting ourselves against the Martians. The fact that all this enemy construction is taking our attention away from the real enemies we should have, which are poverty, malnutrition, famine, world epidemics, and above all global warming and the catastrophes lying in the way for our future. Those are our real enemies, but they're not unifying. They don't bolster your economic well-being, or so it's thought. So they are just problems we have to face on a rather partial, fragmented national level. The real enemy is some set of people who are out to get you, the evil empire, whoever it is. And of course, sadly, it's a sort of rebounding, echoing chamber. If you start threatening and considering someone as an enemy, they're very quickly going to reciprocate by starting thinking, well, they're trying to make us into an enemy, they must be our enemy, and so it goes back and forth. Absolutely absurd and ridiculous, but I see no near outcome which will get rid of this paranoia and aggression.